All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Agana Nsiire-Agana, and I'm going to be sharing with you some reflections on the Theological Anthropology chapter that I've contributed to the Handbook. And I've been thinking, partly as a result of hearing a lot of the presentations and discussions so far, that I would perhaps share with you some reflections on where I think um, theological anthropology may be already starting to go moving forward from the handbook. And in the process of doing that, touch on some of the themes that are contained in the chapter itself. So, one of the first things I'll share with you is a consideration on the theme of embodiment, which comes up very strongly when you look at a lot of the literature being produced around what it means to be a human being in connection with technology, and what it means for technology to either enhance or disrupt or extend or harm human beings. And a big part of that has to do with the presence and the materiality of human beings as bodies. Okay. So there is a lot by way of ethical and political critique around the impact of social media on self-perception and body shaming, all those kinds of things. But I think one of the things that we might want to start also thinking about is engaging the question of the body, not only in terms of those politics, but also in terms of deeper considerations about the relationship between the body and the environment writ large. Okay, so stepping back from technology as technology per se and looking at it as part of an integral whole, an environment in which we exist. Okay, and I think when you do that, certain interesting questions start to come up. Okay, so for example, increasingly we realize from a scientific perspective just how interconnected we are with the biological environment. So if you think about our microbial environment, the very fact that there are more external microbes in and around us than our own cells, that starts to point you in the direction of this deep and fundamental continuity that we share with the physical environment. And we harness that kind of idea for ecological purposes, right? So that connection fuels, or at least can fuel, theological reflections around stewardship, like some presenters have been talking about. Eco-theology can flow from things like that. When it comes to considering similar embeddedness in relation to technology, there seems to be a little bit more reticence. Okay. But I think a lot more thought can be put into considerations of how other schemes of reality, other metaphysics, do indeed show us to be more continuous than we often imagine, with technologies. So if you consider metaphysical renditions of reality that try to move away from discrete particles as constituting material reality, and emphasize other things like energy and fields and wave particle dualities or even motion, you start to see how the materiality question unifies us or can at least unify us in very fundamental ways. The extent to which we want to explore that, and the extent to which we can harness that is not a field that's being seriously grappled with so far. So that's one interesting first area I think we could start to explore within digital theology when it comes to anthropology. Okay. And then moving on from that, and focusing on how we actually do talk about the human and the technological, and several of us have already spoken about the preeminence of certain standard rubrics within theology, like the Imago Dei. You do start to think that maybe a meta sort of reflection can start to happen around what we actually do when we have this conversation. Okay. And what I mean by that is if you took all the literature that's been produced in the name of digital theology and all the literature that you might want to rope into digital theology as a field, and you scanned it all you might start to ask yourself, why all the fuss about why technology is so special? There seems to be a certain esoteric undercurrent, even when theologians deny the divinity, for example, of these technologies. The very question, being raised suggests a certain comfort with the possibility of it. And I say this with regard to divinity, but you can also say this with regard to very general views of how technology is magicalized, whether in popular terms, or in more conceptual terms. You start to wonder whether we do not necessarily spiritualize technology just by talking about it. Is there something in the nature of theology that brings that to the table? And is that something we want to consider, and how would we begin to do that? And again, the question of how that would be harnessed, because it's not necessarily a bad thing, comes up. Or maybe it is a bad thing and has to be avoided. But it's just something that, is worth flagging, I think, if we want to think about how technology really engages with questions of being human. What does a human bring? And given that theology is inherently human, is there something necessarily spiritual about it because there's something necessarily spiritual about humanity, vice versa? And what can we do with all of that? So those are more on the metaphysical side of things. And theological anthropology generally, before you even come to the digital question, is heavily imbued with metaphysical conversations, as you will know. But it's also highly ethical. And, going back to more classical treatments, perhaps you would say that the ethics question in theological anthropology has had to do with those same standard rubrics. So the Imago Dei and the moral status of humanity in relation with one another, and the expectation of alignment, if you like, between the creature and the creator. But really, within the digital technology conversation, I think that the ethics question has been pushed as part of the general turn towards the individual, the turn to contextuality, the turn to selfhood, within the context of modern conversations on self-identity, right? Again, so these are themes that, the chapter broadly highlights and tries to trace in terms of the conceptual provenances of these ideas. But, moving on from that, and these here specifically are things that are being touched on already, I should say. There should be a deeper engagement, I think, with what happens to a concept like personhood beneath the hood. And by beneath the hood, I do mean beneath the interface with which we engage with technology. So if you think, for example, about social media or artificial intelligence, okay, beneath the visual and sound and tactile interfaces that we encounter these technologies lies a certain algorithmic space and world of perceptions, well, maybe not perceptions from that perspective, but of representations at least, right? Representations of the human self, characterizations of personality, characterizations of behavior and attitude and interests and likes and dislikes, etc., that map out certain patterns and paradigms of individuality and ways of existence, which of course serves technology companies well, because these are the fundamental units of extraction. These are the commodity basis out of which money is able to be made of human persons. But beyond recognizing it, there is little reflection so far on how that technical reality, right, feeds into ethics. Okay. And so just another thing to flag up, and I'm calling that technically engaged digital theology 3, sort of pigging back on the very famous What is Digital Theology paper that P. Phillips and Kyle and Jonas have written. So that's taking theological reflection on the digital into the digital. And there I do think that a little bit more, if not on our own part as theologians, then certainly in a type of interdisciplinary engagement with technology practitioners, I think we need to sink a little bit beneath the hood and actually start to interrogate that stratum of things. It could be very, very productive for the ethics of personhood. And then out of that, I think the critiques that would flow could more concretely speak to new paradigms of social organization, economic organization, that, you know, a lot of us have called techno-capitalism. Some people are starting to call type of technological feudalism. And as part of that consideration, and also just pushing it forward a little bit, I'm reflecting on the extent to which our imagination of the future of humanity, our theological imagination of the future of humanity, might feed into certain myths of progress. Okay, the terminology that surrounds the discourse lends itself to a basic assumption that moving forward, technologically speaking, becoming more advanced is better. You know, more sophisticated artificial intelligence, more capable machines. It's a better thing than not. Why is this so? And is it necessarily true? I think there can be some self-critical reflection on that question as well. And again, is it a bad thing at all? Perhaps not. But again, the discourse remains rather thin at this point. And touching on that imagination, or staying there for a little bit longer, there is a lot by way of theological discussions of eschatological visions, right? But while that goes on, I think attention needs to be paid as well to responses to present anxieties flowing out of our encounter with the digital. So I'm thinking about the very recent developments in Australia, now in the UK, where social media is being banned for young people, or restricted in certain ways in other contexts. So that is a type of interaction with technology. You know, restriction from technology is an interaction with technology, and akin to, even though not the same as, a certain digital access issue, right? There are raised questions of anxiety and privilege and access and the ethics of who can determine what, you know, and for whom, that need to be attended to. And also just pastoral responses for, you know, a generation that have grown up being described as digital natives, who have been projected, for all intents and purposes, as owning the digital reality, at least as it's socially constructed, and as being responsible for shaping its future, you know. So what does the social progression look like under a new paradigm in which people, you know, these people are kept out? And I think that needs to run alongside all the more critical theological perspectives that would agree, you know, with the need to restrict young people from unfettered access. So these are a couple of considerations. There is also the question of theology itself and how it's done. So some methodological considerations around moving away from analysis to more committed, constructive positions. Okay, and here there might be some humility required of us, or there might be some bravery sometimes here and there required of us. But I think more and more it becomes imperative for us to, rather than stick with classical formulations and try to apply them as critical analytical lenses, or to ask in very vague and carefully couched, because perhaps religiously committed ways, how technology might influence these classical categories. Perhaps the time is upon us to start to really, really think about how we might wholly reconstruct theology itself as a contribution towards you know, the general human reconstruction of itself and of its futures. And I think it's one of the ways for theology to be, you know, more seriously roped into more global, more secular, if you like, non-religious conversations around AI and technology and human progress in general. But it's also just incumbent, if we actually take seriously that humanity is not a static thing, and it goes through iterations and cycles, and however you want to conceptualize change. right, then perhaps it's time to do some conceptual reengineering using technology as an impetus, at least, if not as a resource in itself, but I think it can serve that as well. So yes, those are a few considerations I thought I'd share with you. I'll stop here and